Joining me now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell and Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson. So, Kelly, first, the president, he's going to be testing some of his 2024 messages to this very friendly group of firefighters, right?
There might be no more loyal a group than the firefighters union. So this is friendly territory, and we will likely get a sense of how the president defines his own message for the expected 2024 campaign being here. Now, when it comes to some division among House Democrats and President Biden, any daylight between them is an unusual thing. And this centers on some issues that don't always come into the national conversation. The president supports statehood for D.C. And so the idea of the D.C. City Council being able to enact its own legislation, and of course, because of the way a federal district works, it's not a state. Things come to the president's desk for him to sign or reject. And in this case, the council is considering some changes to its own city criminal code that could change penalties for certain offenses. And in the city of Washington, there is a concern about safety, and there is a pushback to not have that happen. And President Biden is taking the position that he wants to have that stronger message about safety. So he does not support this legislation. Democrats had been this tough vote for them, and they had been lining up to support D.C. because they want to send the message that they believe that those who are elected by the residents of the district should let their representatives in the D.C. Council put forward their legislation. So those are sort of the lines there. And now the council is saying we're going to pull that bill. It takes it out of the realm of the president being the decider here and being on the unexpected side of House Republicans. So that's the dynamic here. It's been a bit of a messy one in recent days for this White House, where you have the former speaker saying that she wished that Nancy Pelosi, I'm referring to here, of course, saying that wish the White House had let them know. Andrea?
Yeah, just one day before, he was in Baltimore with the House Democrats. Then the next day, he goes to a Senate lunch and tells Senate Democrats he's, let this bill survive. And it's basically a question, Eugene, of D.C. statehood. This is a big issue here. Taxation without representation. This would be the first time since 1991 that the Congress intervened and overruled something that had been decided by legislators here, who can do very little, but at least determine their own budget and their own criminal code. It was the first rewrite of the criminal code. It had been worked on for 16 weeks by all kinds of experts, and there was some measures in it that lessened the penalties, but in most cases, they tightened the penalties. But the president, I think, viewed it as not wanting to look soft on crime, which already, with Lori Lightfoot losing, that primary election in Chicago, has become a big issue against Democrats, especially in big cities.
Right. I think the president decided he was not going to allow himself to look or be vulnerable on that issue. And I think that's why he made that decision. But it run counter to the principle that the people of the District of Columbia, 700,000 people who live here, have no voting representation in Congress. They pay their federal taxes, they are citizens in every way, and they have no voice in the national legislature that has the ability to decide the District of Columbia's laws. And before 1991, in fact, way back when I covered City Hall and our then Mayor Marion Barry, when I first got to the Post, that was one of the big things that any politician in D.C. had to consider, and certainly the D.C. Council had to consider with all legislation, was who was in charge of the congressional subcommittees that essentially had the final say over what happened to D.C., what happened over our laws and policies and everything like that. It is manifestly unfair, and the easy way the simple way to solve this is to have the District of Columbia become the 51st state. But of course, that is politically problematic. Some say it's constitutionally problematic. Yet this injustice, and it's a clear injustice, continues.
Yeah, let me just point out, not to put too fine a point on it, that D.C., for decades a majority black city, not having a voting representative in the House or the Senate. And of course, the objection is mostly from Republicans not wanting a liberal enclave to have an extra senator. Or
exactly, or two senators. They'd have two senators,
exactly.
and Republicans figure, and they're right, that this would make them harder to win and keep a Senate majority if there are two votes that are likely to both go to Democrats, two new Senate votes that are likely to go to Democrats. And that's just the political reality. And so so I don't think Democrats will ever be able to get a statehood bill through the Senate unless there is a huge Democratic majority that's willing to see it through, plus a House majority as well, and a president who would sign it into law.
So there were a bunch of moderate Democrats, who took a tough vote on this thing, and then they were the ones who felt so blindsided when the president pulled the rug out from under them. They felt by switching position on it. The president speaking to the firefighters, and then Kelly, as you pointed out, he's of course thanking them because they were the first union to support him. They've been the strongest union for him. They're a very powerful union, and thanking them for all of their help. We're going to go to him in just a moment as he starts outlining what you've been reporting on, of course, so intensively, are the big themes of his campaign, which is the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and all the ribbon cuttings that he's planning to go to. I'm told in 8 key states they see as the battleground states. Kelly?
Well, certainly the president is trying to buy himself some time to not be a formally declared candidate, but using that time to try to hone the message about things that he believes he's been able to accomplish with Democrats who've been in Congress, but also by working with Republicans, something that's not always popular, even with his own party, but he believes is popular with voters who want to see results. And by carefully choosing the places where that can resonate, and we all know the electoral map gets very narrow about where do our presidential elections ultimately get decided. And one of the big changes we saw is that for Democrats, they want South Carolina to go first in the voting in terms of the primary calendar. We also know that there are key places in areas where the kind of politics of Joe Biden, where there can be some crossover with some of the types of voters that in a broad way had been perhaps picked off by some of the populist kind of Republican tones that are not classic Trump voters, but are in that realm of voters who understand some of the Scranton background of Joe Biden that he thinks that he can speak to. So when you're talking about infrastructure, when you're talking about more affordable health care, when you're talking about union jobs, those kinds of messages that he is trying to convince the public that there has been a record of accomplishment that he can run on, acknowledging that there are many Americans who aren't seeing it when you consider things like the inflationary prices and some of the issues that Americans have been dealing with at their own kitchen tables. Andrea?